I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Elizabeth, great to have you back. As long as we have enough time, we're going to try to talk about two different cases today. First, starting off with an update on a case that we previously discussed, and then getting on to a new case, hopefully, in the second half of today's episode. So a very difficult case we're going to start out with. We have an update in the case of a man who was accused of repeatedly raping his adopted daughter. He entered a plea deal, and we have a resolution to that. Tell me about it.
Yes, it's great to be back, Chance. Wanted to talk to you about Eusebio Castillo. He's 48 years old, and we talked about this a while back. Caleb Downs, who is a reporter with mysanantonio.com, and I teamed up on a story earlier this month about this couple, Eusebio Castillo, 48, and his wife, Laura Castillo, who's 47. Now, as you mentioned, this was a really horrible case of where a man and his wife adopted his niece, and they sexually abused her for more than 15 years. And her uncle actually fathered 3 of her children. And the couple threatened the woman into silence. So what happened is that Eusebio Castillo was sentenced to numerous life sentences yesterday. So in the 187th State District Court, which Judge Joey Contreras presides over, he gave Eusebio Castillo 5 life sentences in this particular plea. So this was an interesting plea that we discussed earlier in that it's called an open plea. And basically there were no stipulations that were made to it. And with attorneys, Mr. Castillo decided to go ahead and roll the dice and let Judge Contreras sentence him. So just to update you a little bit on the case, this woman who has spoken with Caleb Downs many times, her name is Abigail Alvarado. And she, the Express News normally doesn't identify victims of sexual assault, but she did reach out to Caleb, and he has done a really marvelous job of covering this case in depth. The wife in this case, Laura Castillo, pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and she actually was sentenced to 33 years in prison in July. So she is in state prison as we speak. But at Tuesday's sentencing, Judge Contreras really handed down the most severe penalty to Castillo, and there were some very interesting things that he had to say, that the judge actually had to say in court.
Wow, that's a perfect transition into my next question, Elizabeth. What was said in court then?
Judge Contreras told the defendant, and I quote from Caleb's story, "You took a little girl and pretended to offer her a loving home. You had her call you dad and mom. Then you began doing unspeakable damage and harm to her at the age of 9. And he went on to say, "It is not forgivable. It boggles my mind how someone can do that to their own baby." So that is probably one of the most powerful things that I think I've heard a judge say in this particular case. And usually victims, when they give their own impact statement before the defendant, now convict, is taken to the back to be, transported back to jail as they await to go to prison, they can say some pretty, emotional and riveting things. And pretty much in the courtroom, as the sentencing was taking place, you heard these particular things actually coming from, attorneys and from judges in the court. Now, an interesting thing about Mr. Castillo, again, he is sentenced to 5 life sentences, and that we call that a stacking of the sentences. So he is going to die in prison. He has been diagnosed with cancer also, which doctors have said he has a 60% chance of dying within 5 years. But even if that wasn't the case, Mr. Castillo will never, not come out of prison because of this particular sentence.
And then a bit of a follow-up about that sentencing. As we had discussed before here on the podcast, there was a plea in the case. It seemed like that was because the defendant and his legal team was hoping to get some leniency in the sentencing. Obviously, that didn't take place. So was that a miscalculated move on their part, or was there really no way to tell how the sentencing might end up?
That's really interesting, Chance. I think I've heard some attorneys talk about, as you sit in the gallery at a docket call, sometimes you can hear conversations between attorneys and their clients. And at times I have heard conversations where people will say, maybe the judge will go a certain way, or maybe we can plead our case to the judge. And at that time, when it happens, it's really kind of interesting, because when there is a plea, the defendant and his or her lawyer will appear before the bench of the judge, and they will have these conversations. And of course, they've had these conversations with their clients ahead of time. But in my experience covering courts the past several years, when you give the judge full discretion to consider all of the charges, I think what I have seen many times, they will go toward the maximum. Sometimes they'll maybe strike a middle ground on that. But when you have a case like this, 10 counts of aggravated sexual assault that were against Eusebio Castillo, that, apparently was all that Judge Contreras really needed, I would say, to make his decision. So on the first count, Castillo received consecutive life sentences. And then he got 3 more concurrent life sentences. And then the remaining counts, Castillo was sentenced to 20 years each. So those 20 years sentences were likely the maximum on charges that actually were not, 5 to 99 years or life in prison. So any way you divide it out, though, he's not going to be getting out of prison ever.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. So, an update on a case that we've previously discussed here on the podcast. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. We do have several minutes left. Let's move on to this second case for today's episode. The trial of a San Antonio man accused of killing his own father. Obviously, that's a situation that will get headlines, but there are a few details about this case that also will grab people's attention.
Yes, this trial, actually, it's coincidental. This trial is also taking place in the 187th State District Court with Judge Joey Contreras presiding. This is the case against Jesse David Vasquez III. He is 24 years old, and he is accused of killing his father, Jesse David Vasquez Jr., who was 44 years old when he was shot to death on April 17th, 2016. Now, what we know about this particular case is that we've heard in testimony so far is that father and son really didn't get along very well. And they are also alleged to have, done a lot of methamphetamine while together. There were a lot of guns in the house, and there also was either a sword or a machete that father and son would walk around with weapons. Apparently, Dad liked the gun or liked guns, and the son liked a machete. So they were in the house on this particular weekend, and things started happening. They started arguing. Apparently, the son had gone to live with his father and stepmother and stepsisters for a while. And between, I guess, just your, moving back, into your parents' house, for someone in their early 20s, the usual problems. And then you bring, the allegations of drug use in, things escalated on a Sunday evening where there was some sort of family dispute, and the elder Vasquez was shot by the son.
So you've laid the groundwork. Tell me now, Elizabeth, about some of the details that have come out, I think now up to 2 days of trial so far.
Yes, we've seen, we saw a neighbor on the first day of testimony who heard the shots ring out. She described them as pops. And she said that she went to the home, and this is a neighbor who's, diagonally, kind of like, I think the term cat or corner also. So we're talking not right next door, but just like maybe diagonally across. Looked, this person went and saw that, went over to the home. And when she looked inside, saw the victim's wife, Ann Vasquez, doing CPR on her husband. Now, while this was going on, the younger Vasquez was outside, and the witness, who is named Maria Torres, said that the younger Vasquez appeared nervous and paced at times, and she asked him why he shot his father, and Ms. Torres testified that the young man shrugged and seemed confused by the question, and she told the jury that he said he didn't regret it and that he wasn't sorry. So other things that have come out about this is that, as I mentioned earlier, father and son had a rocky relationship. And Ann Vasquez, who is the defendant's stepmother and the wife of the victim, testified that, she did admit that there were problems between father and son, but also admitted that her husband had some sort of, he at times had been violent, and she admitted that her husband had hit her occasionally. And on the day of the shooting, he struck one of her daughters. So the testimony that we're hearing right now about that is actually from one of the defendant's stepsisters, who while on the stand told jurors that she felt like there was something something bad would happen that particular weekend, because she said that things between her stepfather and her stepbrother were escalating. And she also talked about witnessing her stepbrother taking Xanax and actually offering it to a younger sister at the house. So, we're hearing right now that there, were some things that were escalating between the two men. And then, when you bring in the drug use as well, that is something that that both prosecutors and defense attorneys, will challenge. And the particular thing that's being challenged right now by the defense is that the victim actually had the gun that is believed to have been used on him by his son moments before the shooting happened. The witness testified that the father took the gun and grabbed his son and pointed it at his face and said, "I should shoot you." And this happened during an argument. So defense attorney Jessica Gonzalez was asking the witness who testified, the stepsister, Miranda, whether or not she felt like she had been threatened, and in the middle of all of this testimony, you're kind of seeing where the defense is going with that. At the beginning, in opening statements, prosecutor Josh Sandoval pointed out to the jury that the defense would likely call this a case of self-defense because there were instances that would happen that they would hear about in testimony. And this seems to be the thing that they were talking about, because we have a witness who was testifying for the state who said that she saw her stepfather put a gun to her stepbrother's face shortly before the shooting occurred. So this will be an interesting case to watch, Chance, because even though you have a history of violence here between father and son, it's probably going to boil down to how the defense argues as to, whether or not this was indeed a self-defense, a case of self-defense, or if it was murder.
And then before we wrap things up, Elizabeth, something that caught my eye, I want to make sure this is correct. I don't believe the defense gave an opening statement. Is that true? And is that common? Does that happen?
Chance, that's a good question. It happens periodically. And what, when the state has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt whether something happened in a case for the jury. So they actually get to they give an opening statement, and then the defense has the option to give their statement then. Many times, sometimes, not many times, but sometimes, as in this case, defense attorneys will do what they call waive their opportunity, or just wait until the state has finished presenting their case. Now, and in that way, I think actually it's a little bit, at least if I were a juror, I would think it would be a little better to actually hear that, because it's almost like you're starting an entirely different case. And in a sense you are, because it's the defense's turn to present their own witnesses. So what they did in this case was Jessica Gonzalez and Amy Owen told Judge Contreras that they would reserve their opening statement until they present their case. So when that happens, once the state stands up and they say they rest, the defense will come up, and then sometimes they will put up a They'll put, a photograph, or they'll use a PowerPoint presentation, and they'll put up details, and then they will present their case, and then they will tell the jurors, they'll give them a little bit of a preview as to what they're going to do and which, witnesses they would call. So we have not seen that yet in this particular case. So maybe by the time we talk again, I'll have a resolution on this case, or we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the defense case if they are still in trial.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me as always for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio and Bexar County from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.